So I've got this fun little bird painting that I did today. It was a little bit of an impromptu session playing with some new pigments that I got, which are these supervision layered watercolors. That's what they call them. I would more usually call these granulating and separating pigments. They are a Chinese brand, and on the website they are called layered, and it's because they kind of separate out into multiple colors. You can see on these tubes they have multiple colors and hues on the label even, and that is what each of these paints actually separates out into, which sounds super fun. So I had to try these out after one of my artist friends, Sophie Cleason, recommended the brand. So I start off with putting them into my palette dish here and getting some water to get them diluted down to the right consistency to start painting. And I'm using an Etcher hot press watercolor pad, watercolor block, and just starting to paint. At this point, I don't actually have any idea of what I'm going to paint. As I said, this started off as a very impromptu session, and mainly it was just to start playing with these colors and to see what they would do, because I had so far only seen them online. I'm often asked if I plan out my paintings when I do something like this, and the answer is definitely no. When I'm working with a new medium, I really want to just play with them and see what they're capable of. And one of the things I noticed off the bat here is that, remember those labels with those bright blues and purples? It doesn't look like that when I first start putting the paint onto the page. In fact, it looks very brown and muddy colored. And this is because you could see, even in the squeezed pigment out on my palette, multiple hues. There are two colors, pigments, that are mixed inside these tubes. And so at this point, my daughter was sitting next to me and she looked at my paper and she says, "That doesn't look very pretty." And I had to agree with her, but I had faith that they were going to look eventually like I had been expecting. And so I just let the pigment do its thing, and I just start trailing out some little tendrils to play with the paint on my paper surface. And I know that if I just let the pigment separate out, give it time, give it liquid, and give it a lot of pigment, that it will start to look more interesting. And even as I'm painting here, as you're watching the paint dry slowly on the page, you can sort of see, especially in that upper left-hand blob of color, that some orange and blues are starting to pull out from each other. Remember how very neutral brown it looked when I initially stuck it on the page? Already you can start to see the separation happening. What began initially as just basically color swatches, blobbing of color onto my page, I began to think needed a little bit of focus, so I decided to add birds. I love painting birds. They're fun. They add liveliness, they add movement, and I just enjoy painting them. So a bird is what started to happen here. And I begin to paint a bird in this upper blob, and you can see the purple is still wet. That's what kind of gives the paint a little bit of an interesting area to bleed into as I do this wing and let the tail trail into the wet area of the purple. Now this bottom section over here is mostly dry surface that I am painting onto, so I do not have to worry about or take into consideration bleed of the wet paint, and instead I can just focus on having sharp edges and contours to the shape that I am painting. And I start trailing off the feathers of the wing. I'm using Tracy Levinzon's goat hair and synthetic 1-inch medium brush for the majority of this painting right now. It's really ideal for this sort of work where I'm just sort of playing with color and pigment on the page, and I want very long, expressive trailing lines because the brush holds a lot of liquid and pigment, and I barely need to dip it back into my reservoir to gain more paint when I want to use the same color, and I only need to go back when I am renewing with a different color. Meanwhile, it has this very fine tip point that allows me to do the detail like I am with these birds, and with the fine details of their beaks and feathers and wings, as well as with all the very organic trailing edges and lines that go off onto the side. You're really starting to see now how the color is separating in that reddish blob on the left side in particular. And that's why I started focusing more on this color for the birds. I decided to use it since it was the most intense of the three that I initially pulled out onto my palette. What's interesting is that you see that blue neck and head on that bird in the upper right. I didn't paint that specifically as a here's a blue, here's a red section. I just used this one pigment, and the way it ended up settling down, it turned into this very separated look where the bird has these multiple hues and colors in it, which is a lot of fun to do, and a lot of fun to use it then in this way. Adding some more birds in. By now, the base washes are dry, and so I can paint without having fear of the pigment, the wet pigment that I am laying down, spreading out into the initial wash sections. And I can be more definitive with my lines and with my edges and with my trailing little bits. I decided to add some little birds seated on a perch, perhaps in some undergrowth or some leafy tendrils and vines in this lower bottom area to give some contrast to the flowing movement of the ones that are in flight up above. I have a little bit of the feel of painting Chinese landscapes as I do this section with some stone and groundwork. The lines, the expressiveness of lines are important in this kind of rendering. And again, this brush is ideally suited for that kind of work. I'm following the contours of the blobby wash that I initially laid down. I'm using that to guide my strokes. And again, none of this was planned out, and so I'm just enhancing what is already there and taking what has been laid down and moving with that flow. Some small little plant bits trailing upwards. Perhaps these are little flower heads. Trailing grasses, silhouetted against the paler color of the initial wash in the background. Those first birds have had a chance to dry now, and so at this point I'm taking a smaller number 0 round brush. This is a Rosemary and Company Kolinsky sable, and I am using this to dry brush in some finer details and rendering of these birds. I'm starting off with darkening their heads and their necks with the textures of feathers, and very delicately laying in some of this textury stuff on top of what the separating and granulating pigments already created. You'll notice that in my initial glazing wash, I left a lot of white space because these are great for little highlight bits. They add some sparkle to your subject matter to have the white of the paper showing through in bits like this. We're going to move into time lapse for this small detailed segment of the painting at this point. And I lifted some of the pigment out from the chest and the wing of the birds. That's why you're seeing now this bright kind of coral pink color, which I found interesting as well. The original tones were this separated deep rosy red with blue, and when I lifted the color, it turned instead into this coral shade, which is a beautiful one as the highlights for these birds. You can see here on this upper bird how that blue separated out gorgeously with very little effort on my part, and the white sparkle of the paper showing through is very nice in that section as well. Trailing little bits of feathers. This sharp edged dry brush work adds some contrast to the very misty, flowy washes of the initial background area. And then I'm extending the background a little bit over here because I wanted to balance the flow of the composition a little bit more, lifting out some of the highlights on the ground over here, and then adding some sharper highlights with white gel pen. Enhancing the details of these small birds in the front foreground, as I did with the flying ones. Lifted out some of the colors on their chests, left the blue on their wings, and darkened their heads a little bit. All of this is done primarily dry brush with that number 0 round brush. A little bit of an edge of highlight with the white gel pen. And then now I'm taking some gold artistic oil paint. This is a mica paint. And I'm loading up my brush and then just tapping it sharply with my finger. This splatters some of the gold across the page in a random splatter pattern. And finally, here's a close-up of that so you can see what that gold splatter did. It just adds yet another random element of noise and texture and pattern. Here's another piece using the same sort of techniques and another one of those supervision colors. It's more of a turquoisey yellow color this time as the base. And I'm starting this off without any real intention of what I'm going to create. But of course, birds are always fun, so let's do birds.